The church sat on the edge of a narrow road just outside a small town in Atlanta. White walls. Dark windows. A wooden cross standing taller than every building around it. People said you could hear the Sunday singing from nearly half a mile away. Families drove in from nearby towns just to sit inside that sanctuary for 1 hour every week and listen to Pastor Elijah Monroe preach about faith, loyalty, and family. To the people who followed him, Elijah Monroe was more than a pastor. He was the foundation of the town itself. He had built the church from almost nothing nearly 30 years earlier, starting with a rented storefront and folding chairs before turning it into one of the most respected ministries in the county. People trusted him with their marriages, their confessions, their money, their children. And standing beside him almost every Sunday was his son. Pastor Daniel Monroe was everything the congregation hoped the church would become after Elijah retired. Quiet, soft-spoken, disciplined. The kind of man who stayed behind after service to stack chairs while everyone else went home. People trusted Daniel because he never acted like he was above anyone. If someone's car broke down, Daniel showed up. If a family needed prayer at 2 in the morning, Daniel answered the phone. The church loved him because he felt safe. And when Daniel introduced his new wife to the congregation, the entire church believed they were witnessing the beginning of a perfect future. Her name was Naomi. She arrived in town less than 2 years before the wedding. Beautiful voice. Quiet smile. Soft eyes that made people feel comfortable almost immediately. The first time she sang inside the church, the room went completely silent before the final note even finished leaving her mouth. By the next Sunday, people were already calling her First Lady. The older women in the church adored her. The younger girls copied the way she dressed. And Elijah Monroe seemed especially proud whenever she stood beside his son. At first, nobody thought anything about it. Elijah introduced her during services, praised her voice publicly, encouraged her to sing at conferences outside the city, told the congregation she had a special gift from God. And Daniel believed every word. He believed his father loved her because she made him happy, because she brought life back into the church, because after years of helping carry the ministry beside his aging parents, Daniel finally looked like a man building a family of his own. But there was another reason Daniel trusted his father completely. His mother was sick. For nearly 4 years, Margaret Monroe had quietly battled worsening health problems that most of the congregation knew almost nothing about. Some Sundays she appeared strong enough to sit in the front row beside her husband. Other weeks she stayed home completely. The church simply called it exhaustion. Daniel spent most nights helping care for her after church services ended, driving her to appointments, managing medications, helping around the house whenever Elijah traveled for ministry conferences. And Elijah traveled often, especially after Naomi joined the church. At first, the trips seemed innocent. Regional revivals, music conferences, weekend ministry events. Naomi sang. Elijah preached. Daniel stayed behind to manage the church and take care of Margaret. Nobody questioned it because the arrangement looked honorable. In fact, people praised it. They praised Elijah for mentoring his future daughter-in-law, praised Naomi for serving the ministry so faithfully, praised Daniel for sacrificing his own time to support both his parents and the church. From the outside, the Monroe family looked untouchable. A powerful father, a loyal son, a gifted wife, a respected ministry, the kind of family churches build sermons around. But perfect families usually hide their secrets better than everyone else. And inside the Monroe home, long before the church anniversary celebration that would eventually destroy everything, somebody had already started noticing things that did not make sense. Small things at first. Late-night phone calls that stopped the second someone entered the room. Conference schedules that changed without explanation. Hotel receipts that appeared in jacket pockets from cities Elijah never mentioned visiting. Moments of silence between Naomi and Elijah that lasted just a little too long. Nothing strong enough to accuse anyone of anything, but enough to leave a feeling behind. The kind of feeling that sits quietly in the corner of a room, waiting. And Margaret Monroe had started paying attention.
If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight.
But then she heard Naomi's voice, soft, barely above a whisper. Margaret froze. The office door was slightly open, just enough for light to spill across the hallway floor. She moved closer without making a sound. And there they were. Elijah sitting behind his desk. Naomi standing beside him. Too close. Much too close. Margaret could not hear every word clearly, But she heard enough. Naomi sounded nervous. Elijah sounded calm. Then Margaret heard him say something that made her stomach tighten instantly. "We've come too far to start panicking now." Silence followed. Then Naomi spoke again. "What if Daniel finds out?" Margaret stopped breathing. The room became completely still. For several seconds nobody moved. Then Elijah stood slowly from his chair and placed both hands on Naomi's shoulders. And Margaret saw it. Not lust. Not excitement. Comfort. Familiarity. The kind shared between two people who had crossed lines a very long time ago. Margaret backed away from the doorway before they could see her. Her chest felt tight. Her hands trembling so badly she had to grip the hallway wall to steady herself. But even then, even after hearing Daniel's name, even after seeing the way Elijah touched her, Margaret still did not want to believe what her mind was beginning to understand. Because accepting the truth would mean accepting something far worse. This would not just be betrayal. It would destroy her son. The next morning, Margaret watched them carefully during breakfast. Daniel noticed nothing. He smiled while pouring coffee for Naomi. Asked Elijah about the conference turnout. Talked about church repairs and upcoming baptisms. Normal conversation. Normal family. Meanwhile, Margaret sat quietly at the table watching Naomi avoid eye contact whenever Daniel touched her hand. Watching Elijah answer questions too quickly. Watching small nervous glances pass between them when they thought nobody noticed. And for the first time in 35 years, Margaret became afraid of her own husband. Not because she thought he would hurt her, but because she realized she no longer knew who he truly was. And once that fear entered her mind, she could not remove it. Especially after she started looking at the children differently. Because suddenly, features she once ignored no longer felt accidental. The oldest boy had Elijah's eyes. The youngest daughter had his smile. And once Margaret noticed it, she could never unsee it. For the next several weeks, Margaret Monroe said nothing to anyone. Not to Daniel. Not to church members. Not even to herself out loud. Because speaking the suspicion into existence would make it real. And deep down, Margaret still hoped she was wrong. She wanted there to be another explanation. A misunderstanding. A coincidence. Anything that would allow her to believe her family had not been living inside a lie for nearly a decade. But the problem with suspicion is that once it enters the mind, it changes the way you see everything. Margaret started noticing patterns she had ignored for years. Elijah suddenly volunteering to babysit whenever Daniel worked late at church. Naomi calling Elijah before calling her own husband whenever something went wrong. Private jokes between them that Daniel never seemed to understand. Moments of silence that felt too familiar, too practiced. And the more Margaret observed them, the more she realized something terrifying. This relationship had not grown accidentally. It had been carefully hidden. One afternoon, while Daniel was preparing for Bible study downstairs, Margaret sat alone in her bedroom looking through old family photo albums she had not touched in years. At first, she told herself she was only searching for pictures for the church anniversary celebration. But that was not the truth. She was searching for a timeline. Page after page passed beneath her trembling fingers. Church events. Family vacations. Birthdays. Conference photos. Then she found the picture that made her stop breathing. It had been taken nearly 11 years earlier at a regional ministry conference in Nashville. Daniel and Naomi were still engaged at the time. Elijah stood beside Naomi in the photo smiling proudly while Daniel stood several feet away speaking with another pastor in the background. At first glance it looked harmless. But Margaret's eyes fixed on one detail immediately. Elijah's hand resting against Naomi's lower back. Not awkwardly. Not formally. Comfortably. Possessively. The kind of touch people stop thinking about after crossing boundaries too many times. Margaret stared at the photograph for almost a full minute before slowly turning the page. More conference pictures followed. And suddenly the timeline became impossible to ignore. Trip after trip. Conference after conference. Always together. Even before the wedding. Margaret's heart pounded harder with every page. Then came another realization. Naomi had joined the church less than 2 years before marrying Daniel. But somehow, Elijah had already become deeply involved in her life unusually fast. He personally encouraged her ministry. Personally arranged her conference appearances. Personally introduced her to leadership circles. At the time, everyone praised him for helping a young woman find her purpose in the church. Now Margaret saw something else. Control. Proximity. And the deeper she looked into the past, the uglier the pattern became. That night Margaret barely slept. She lay awake beside Elijah listening to him breathe in the darkness while memories replayed endlessly inside her mind. Then another memory surfaced. One she had ignored for years because it seemed insignificant at the time. The wedding. Margaret remembered how quickly everything had happened once Daniel proposed. The planning. The church announcements. The pressure to move the wedding date sooner because Elijah claimed God was moving the union forward. At the time it sounded spiritual. Now it sounded strategic. Margaret slowly turned her head toward the man sleeping beside her. And for the first time since marrying him, she felt disgust instead of comfort. The next morning she made a decision. If the truth was real, she needed proof. Not suspicion. Not emotions. Proof. Because accusing the founder of the church without evidence would destroy not only the family, but the entire congregation. And if she was wrong, the damage could never be repaired. So Margaret did something nobody in the Monroe family would ever imagine her doing. She hired a private investigator. Quietly. Carefully. Without telling a single person. 3 days later, she sat inside a small office nearly 40 minutes outside town speaking to a former investigator named Calvin Reeves. Margaret kept her voice low while explaining the situation. At first, even Calvin looked uncomfortable. Not because the accusation sounded impossible, but because he recognized the Monroe name immediately. Everyone in that part of Atlanta knew the church. Margaret slid several photographs across the desk. Conference pictures. Travel schedules. Copies of hotel receipts she found hidden inside Elijah's office drawer. Calvin studied them silently. Then he asked the question Margaret had been trying to avoid asking herself. How long do you think this has been going on? Margaret stared down at the photographs for several seconds before answering. I think it started before my son married her. The room fell silent. Even saying the words aloud made Margaret feel physically sick. Because now the possibility had transformed into something much more dangerous. She was right. Then Daniel had never truly been Naomi's husband. He had simply been the cover story. Once Calvin Reeves officially began investigating the Monroe family, the illusion surrounding the church started falling apart faster than Margaret expected. Because unlike church members, investigators do not look at people emotionally. They look at patterns. And within the first 2 weeks, Calvin found more inconsistencies than Margaret had uncovered in nearly 9 years. Travel records showed Elijah and Naomi booking rooms on the same hotel floors repeatedly during conferences across multiple states. Phone logs revealed late-night calls lasting hours whenever Daniel stayed behind in Atlanta. Receipts placed them together in cities where no church events had even been scheduled. But the detail that disturbed Calvin most was not the affair itself. It was how organized everything appeared. The trips had structure. Timing. Preparation. This was not reckless behavior. It was routine. Years of routine. Margaret listened quietly every time Calvin updated her. Sometimes sitting perfectly still for entire conversations without speaking once. Each new detail felt like another piece of her marriage being removed in front of her. But nothing prepared her for the photographs. The first envelope arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Margaret waited until she was alone before opening it inside her bedroom. Inside were dozens of surveillance photos. Elijah and Naomi entering hotels together. Leaving restaurants together. Walking through airport terminals side by side with their heads lowered. And then one particular photograph stopped Margaret cold. Elijah kissing Naomi inside a parking garage nearly 3 years before Daniel married her. Margaret's hands began shaking so badly the photograph slipped onto the floor. 3 years before the wedding. Not months. Years. Everything Daniel believed about his marriage had been built on a lie before it even started. Margaret covered her mouth trying to stop herself from crying out loud. Because she finally understood the full truth. Her son had never been the center of Naomi's life. He had been the shield protecting the real relationship from public suspicion. And somehow, the entire church had helped build that shield without realizing it. That same night, Margaret sat at the kitchen table staring at family photographs while another horrifying thought entered her mind. The children. For weeks she had tried forcing that suspicion away. Tried convincing herself she was imagining the resemblance between Elijah and the 2 youngest grandchildren. But now the idea refused to leave her alone. The eyes. The smile. The shape of their face. Margaret felt sick every time she looked at them. And eventually, suspicion became unbearable. So she made another decision. One even Calvin warned her could permanently destroy the family if she was wrong. Margaret secretly ordered DNA tests. She did it carefully. Quietly. Without attracting attention. One sample came from Elijah's hairbrush. Another from cups used by the children during a family dinner. Everything collected slowly over several weeks while pretending life was still normal. And during that time, Daniel remained completely unaware. He continued preaching every Sunday, continued caring for his mother, continued trusting both his father and his wife with the kind of loyalty only good people give. Watching him became almost unbearable for Margaret, because every act of kindness from her son now felt tragic. Then the results arrived. Margaret opened the envelope alone. At first, her eyes struggled to focus on the page. Then she saw the words clearly. Probability of biological relationship, 99.98%. She stopped breathing. Not one child. Two of Daniel's children were biologically linked to Elijah Monroe. Margaret lowered the papers slowly onto the table as tears filled her eyes. For several seconds she simply sat there in silence, staring at the wall. Not angry. Not shocked anymore. Broken. Because the DNA results confirmed something much darker than adultery. This had become generational betrayal. A father had secretly destroyed his own son's family while standing beside him in church every week, pretending to guide him spiritually. And somehow the deception had lasted nearly a decade. But Margaret was no longer thinking like a wife, or even a mother. Now she was thinking like someone preparing for war. Over the next month she began organizing everything. Photographs, travel timelines, phone records, hotel receipts, DNA reports. Every piece of evidence carefully labeled and stored. Calvin watched the transformation happen slowly. The weak, grieving woman who first walked into his office had disappeared. In her place stood someone colder. Someone patient. Because Margaret had finally decided something important. Private confrontation would not be enough. Not after years of deception. Not after using Daniel as a shield. Not after turning the church itself into a hiding place. If the truth was going to come out, it would come out where the lie had lived the longest. Inside the church. Once Margaret Monroe decided the truth would be exposed publicly, everything about her behavior changed. And that frightened Calvin Reeves more than the evidence itself. Because Margaret stopped reacting emotionally. She stopped crying during meetings. Stopped asking questions she already knew the answers to. Stopped hoping she was wrong. Instead, she became organized. Precise. Every morning she sat alone in the dining room with folders spread across the table like a prosecutor preparing for trial. Dates highlighted. Conference schedules matched against hotel receipts. Phone records arranged beside church calendars. DNA reports sealed carefully inside separate envelopes. Margaret spent hours building timelines that stretched back nearly 10 years. And the deeper she went, the uglier the pattern became. There were trips Elijah claimed were ministry emergencies that never existed. Donations missing from conference budgets. Private vacations disguised as church assignments. Entire weekends where Daniel believed his father and wife were attending spiritual retreats together while they were actually staying alone in hotels hours away from any ministry event. Every lie connected perfectly to another. The deception had become a system. And somehow Daniel had stood directly in the center of it for years without seeing any of it. That was the part destroying Margaret the most. Not the affair. Not even the children. It was the fact that her son had loved them honestly, while they lied to his face almost every day of his adult life. Meanwhile, inside the church, preparations had already begun for the largest celebration in ministry history. Founders Appreciation Sunday. 30 years of Elijah Monroe leading the church. The event would bring former members, pastors, choir groups, and community leaders from across Georgia into the small Atlanta town for one massive service honoring the Monroe family legacy. Banners were printed. Special choir rehearsals scheduled. Church members volunteered for decorations and catering. And every single time Margaret watched people praise Elijah publicly, her hatred grew deeper. Especially when she saw Daniel standing beside his father smiling proudly. Completely unaware that his entire life was about to collapse. Naomi noticed changes in Margaret too. At first, only small things. Margaret watching her silently during dinner. Holding eye contact a little too long. Listening carefully whenever Elijah mentioned travel plans. But Naomi never said anything. Because people hiding secrets often become skilled at pretending normal behavior is real. And Elijah remained completely confident. That confidence came from arrogance. Years without consequences had convinced him he was untouchable. He still preached every Sunday about loyalty and righteousness. Still placed his hands on church members and prayed for their marriages. Still stood beside Daniel publicly calling him the future of this ministry. And every time Margaret heard it, she felt physically sick. 3 weeks before Founders Appreciation Sunday, Calvin brought Margaret the final piece of evidence. Security footage. A hotel recording from nearly 8 years earlier showing Elijah and Naomi checking into a conference hotel together 2 nights before Daniel and Naomi officially announced their engagement. The timestamp mattered, because it destroyed every possible excuse. This was not emotional confusion after marriage. Not temptation that developed later. The relationship already existed while Naomi was preparing to marry Daniel. Margaret stared at the footage for nearly a full minute before speaking. "When this comes out," she said quietly, "my son is going to lose everything." Calvin hesitated before answering. "He already lost it years ago. He just doesn't know it yet." That sentence stayed inside Margaret's mind for days, because she knew it was true. Daniel had unknowingly built his entire future around people betraying him. And the worst part was that he still defended them constantly. One night after Bible study, Margaret overheard church members gossiping about online rumors involving another pastor from a nearby county caught cheating on his wife. Daniel shook his head immediately. "My father would never dishonor this family like that," he said confidently. "Some men still fear God." Margaret felt her heart break listening to him. Because Daniel still believed his father was the safest man in his life. And Elijah kept letting him believe it. By the week of the anniversary celebration, Margaret had everything prepared. The evidence was copied multiple times. Video files loaded onto external drives. DNA reports sealed inside folders. A complete timeline printed and organized. Even the church projector system had already been tested. Carefully. Quietly. Without attracting suspicion. Margaret chose her moment with terrifying patience. Not during a random Sunday service. Not during private family dinner. She wanted the truth revealed at the exact moment the church planned to celebrate Elijah Monroe as a spiritual example for the entire community. Because in Margaret's mind, the betrayal had happened publicly for years. The exposure deserved to be public too. And as Founders Appreciation Sunday finally arrived, the Monroe family walked into church believing they were about to celebrate a legacy. None of them realized they were walking into its funeral. Founders Appreciation Sunday began like every major event the Monroe Church had ever hosted. Packed parking lot. Overflow seating. Choirs arriving from neighboring towns. Women in bright dresses moving through the sanctuary carrying food trays and flower arrangements. Camera crews setting up near the stage to live stream the celebration online. By 11 o'clock, nearly every seat inside the church was filled. People came to celebrate Pastor Elijah Monroe. 30 years of ministry. 30 years of marriage. 30 years of building what many people called the most respected church in that part of Atlanta. A massive banner stretched across the stage behind the pulpit, honoring a man of faith and family. Margaret stared at those words for a long time without speaking. Then she looked toward Elijah standing near the front row greeting guests with the same calm smile he had worn for decades. The smile of a man who believed he controlled the room. Daniel stood beside him proudly introducing his children to visiting pastors. Naomi smiled for photographs while choir members hugged her and complimented her voice. From the outside they still looked perfect. And that was exactly why Margaret chose this day. Because lies survive best when surrounded by admiration. The service began shortly after noon. Choirs sang. Former members gave speeches. Local pastors praised Elijah's leadership and called him a pillar of moral strength in the community. Each compliment felt heavier than the one before it. Margaret sat silently in the front row listening to strangers celebrate a version of her husband that no longer existed. Then Daniel stepped to the pulpit. And for a moment, Margaret almost changed her mind. Because Daniel spoke with complete sincerity. He thanked his father for teaching him integrity. For showing him what a godly husband looked like. For protecting the family through difficult years while Margaret battled health problems. The congregation applauded loudly. Elijah lowered his head humbly like a man receiving honor he believed he deserved. Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes. Not because of Elijah. Because of Daniel. Because every word her son spoke came from love. Real love. And everyone else in the room knew that love was built on lies except him. Then Daniel invited his father to the stage for the final tribute presentation. That was the moment Margaret stood up. At first, almost nobody noticed her moving. A sick older woman rising slowly from the front row did not seem unusual. But then she walked past Daniel, past Elijah, past the podium, and continued toward the media table near the projector controls. The room slowly became quiet. Daniel looked confused first, then concerned. "Mom?" he asked softly. Margaret never answered him. She handed a small flash drive to one of the young media volunteers and calmly said 4 words. "Put this on screen." The young man hesitated. Daniel stepped forward immediately. "Mom, what's going on?" Margaret finally turned toward her son, and the pain in her eyes made the entire room uneasy. "You deserve the truth," she said quietly. Then the projector screen lit up. The first image appeared behind the pulpit. Elijah and Naomi entering a hotel together years earlier. Murmurs spread instantly through the sanctuary. Another image appeared. Airport surveillance photos. Another. Restaurant footage. Another. Travel records. The room descended into confusion almost immediately. Daniel turned slowly toward the screen, his face draining of color with every new image. At first he looked at Naomi. Then Elijah. Waiting for someone to explain. Nobody did. Then the timeline appeared. Dates. Trips. Conference schedules. And finally the words that shattered the room completely. Relationship began prior to marriage. The congregation erupted into shocked whispers. Some people stood. Others pulled out phones. Several church elders rushed toward the stage trying to stop the presentation. But Margaret kept going. Calm. Controlled. Like someone who had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times. Then came the DNA reports. Large scan copies filled the projector screen one after another. Probability of biological relationship. 99.98%. 2 names highlighted beneath the results. 2 children. Daniel stared at the screen as though his mind could no longer process what he was seeing. Then slowly he looked at his father. Elijah still had not spoken. Not once. That silence became more horrifying than denial. Naomi suddenly broke down crying, grabbing Daniel's arm while trying to explain something through tears, but Daniel pulled away from her like he no longer recognized who she was. The church was no longer a church anymore. It had become chaos. People shouting, praying, arguing, crying. And in the middle of it all stood Margaret Monroe holding nearly 10 years of evidence in her hands while the family she once protected collapsed around her in real time. Then the final video began playing. Hotel security footage. Elijah and Naomi embracing inside an elevator nearly 8 years earlier. 2 years before the first child was born. The timestamp remained visible the entire time. Daniel covered his mouth and stumbled backward into one of the front row chairs. The congregation watched him break apart in front of them. And for the first time since the presentation began, Elijah Monroe finally spoke. But before anyone could hear him clearly, the church doors opened, and police officers walked inside the sanctuary. The moment police officers entered the sanctuary, the entire church seemed to stop breathing. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the shouting faded into stunned silence as officers walked slowly down the center aisle toward the stage where Elijah Monroe still stood frozen beneath the glowing projector screen. The same screen that continued displaying photographs, hotel records, and DNA reports behind him like a public judgment no prayer could erase. Daniel remained seated in the front row, staring blankly at the floor. His wife crying beside him. His father standing only a few feet away. His entire life collapsing in front of hundreds of people at once. One of the officers approached Elijah carefully and spoke quietly enough that most of the congregation could not hear the full conversation. But people heard enough. Financial misconduct. Fraud investigation. Misuse of church funds connected to years of undocumented travel expenses and conference payments. The affair had opened the door to something much larger. Several church board members immediately began arguing with investigators near the front stage while others desperately tried calming the congregation. But the church could no longer be controlled. Members cried openly. Families walked out in disbelief. Some defended Elijah loudly, insisting the evidence had to be manipulated. Others stared at him with complete disgust. And through all of it, Margaret never moved. She remained seated quietly near the front row watching the destruction unfold around her with exhausted eyes. Not victorious, not relieved, just empty. Because exposing the truth had not saved her family. It had only revealed how broken it already was. Daniel finally stood several minutes later. Slowly. Like a man carrying weight too heavy for his body. Everyone watched him turn toward Elijah. The entire church waiting for him to scream. To attack him. To demand answers. But Daniel asked only one question. A question so quiet many people barely heard it. How long? Elijah looked at his son for several seconds before answering. And in that moment, for the first time all day, the founder of the church no longer looked powerful. He looked old, tired, cornered. 9 years, he said softly. The room reacted instantly. Gasp, cries, shocked whispers spreading through the sanctuary again. Daniel closed his eyes as though hearing the number physically hurt him. 9 years. almost his entire marriage. Then came the second question. Did you ever love me enough to stop? Elijah tried speaking again, but no words came out, because there was no answer capable of repairing what had been destroyed. Daniel looked toward Naomi next, her makeup ruined from crying, hands shaking uncontrollably. She tried walking toward him again, but Daniel stepped backward immediately. Not angry, not violent. That was what made the moment devastating. He looked at her like a stranger, like someone he had never truly known. Then his eyes moved toward the two children sitting confused beside church members near the front pews. Children too young to understand why adults around them were crying. And something inside Daniel finally broke. He lowered his head and began crying silently in front of the entire congregation. Not like a pastor, not like a leader, like a son, like a husband, like a father realizing his entire life had been built around betrayal. The investigation moved quickly after that day. Church financial records were seized. Former employees came forward anonymously. Stories about Elijah Monroe spread across local news stations within days. The church board suspended him permanently before the month ended. Then came the DNA confirmation through official court testing. 2 children biologically linked to Elijah Monroe, exactly as Margaret's private tests had shown. The scandal destroyed the ministry completely. Attendance collapsed. Families left. Longtime members stopped donating. Pastors who once praised Elijah publicly now refused to mention his name. And eventually the case reached court. By then, Elijah Monroe no longer looked like the respected founder people once admired. The confident preacher who spent decades speaking about morality now sat silently beside attorneys while evidence from nearly 10 years of deception filled the courtroom. Travel records, financial transfers, witness statements, DNA reports. Even more devastating were the testimonies. Church members describing how they trusted him, how they defended him, how they built their lives around his teachings. But the hardest testimony came from Daniel. People expected rage when he took the stand. Instead they got heartbreak. Daniel spoke quietly about trust, about loyalty, about believing his father represented everything good about faith and family. Then he said something that silenced the courtroom completely. The affair destroyed my marriage, he said. But the lies destroyed my ability to know who my family really was. Even the judge remained silent for several seconds after hearing it. When judgment finally came, Elijah received financial crime convictions connected to misuse of church funds and fraud tied to conference travel and ministry expenses. Civil lawsuits followed immediately afterward. But by then, prison was no longer the real punishment. The real punishment had already happened publicly. His legacy was gone. His church shattered. His son broken. His family destroyed in front of the same congregation that once treated him like a spiritual example. And Margaret Monroe, the woman who exposed everything, never returned to the church again. Some people blamed her for destroying the ministry publicly. Others called her brave for revealing the truth. But Margaret stopped responding to opinions long ago, because after living beside deception for nearly a decade, she understood something most people never do. Sometimes the most dangerous betrayals are not committed by enemies. They are committed by the people everyone trusts the most. And in the end, the Monroe family was never destroyed by one moment. It was destroyed slowly, one secret at a time.
If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight.